Subscribe to hear new episodes as they are released. Sherlock Holmes and the Royal Botanic Gardens. The New Adventures, Episode 6. Based on characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Narrated by Carl Mason. The Royal Botanical Gardens is a vast park situated in the southwest London district of Kew. It features an artificial lake and a Chinese pagoda set among intricate landscape designs. The main attraction of these enchanting gardens, however, are the colossal temperate houses. These impressive constructions of glass and steel are symbols of British engineering artistry. Tropical and subtropical greenhouses of similar scale only exist in Munich and Vienna. The frame of Berlin's greenhouse was foolishly constructed of wood and fell victim to a blaze. I would like to begin by relating the circumstance that brought Holmes and me here, as it was not work-related. My therapist, Dr. Kurzman, who was helping me process my traumatic experiences at Highgate Cemetery, has taken interest in my spiritual well-being and believed it would benefit my recovery to go on weekly excursions to the country or seaside. As my loyal companion, Holmes, agreed to accompany me, though he made no secret of the fact that he did so reluctantly. Since he did not care much for the sea and was not keen to surround himself with English townsfolk, we compromised on Kew Gardens. Even so, Holmes was in a cantankerous mood as soon as we arrived. The Palm House, which was constructed between 1841 and 1849, sits in the heart of the park. It is brimming with tropical plants that were grown in pots or imported from overseas. We were on our way there when I made an attempt at an uplifting remark. "Well, Holmes," I began, breaking the silence that had persisted as we walked, "isn't this a splendid park?" Holmes stopped and slowly pivoted until he was facing me. "My dear Watson," he said with an unexpected smile, "do you remember when I said that I would most certainly not enjoy this excursion?" "Why, yes, of course," I said excitedly. Holmes's expression turned sour as he scanned the landscape. "I was right," he said, and continued walking briskly. The exchange reminded me that I had wanted to stop harboring false hopes. I ran a few paces to catch up with Holmes. "But you must admit," I panted, "that Her Majesty's gardens symbolize the grace and sheer boundlessness of the British Empire." Holmes stopped in his tracks. "If you're looking for the essence of the empire," he lectured, "then you're more apt to find it in the Welsh coal mines, the shipyards of Liverpool, the textile mills of Manchester, the steelworks of Glasgow, or the cannon foundries of Newcastle. Should you still insist on using botany as a metaphor for the British Empire, then the only appropriate thing I can think of is a carnivorous plant." Holmes's remarks left me at a brief loss for words. I then growled, "You should stop exchanging so many letters with Mr. Engels," and picked up the pace on the path towards the Palm House. In retrospect, I realized that I had fallen squarely into Holmes's trap, as his intention was merely to affect my silence. Soon thereafter we reached the colossal glass house at the heart of the park. We steered towards the entrance, where we noticed a large crowd. It appeared as if the Palm House had been closed on short notice. Holmes suggested returning home, but I at least wanted to know what had occurred to prevent us from entering the tropical jungle. I pushed my way through the crowd, dragging Holmes along by the hand. We arrived at a barricade in front of the entrance, flanked by 2 security guards. "What on earth is the matter here?" I asked, trying to steal a peek inside the Palm House. "Perhaps the imperial sheen needs some polishing," Holmes mocked, "or a bark beetle infestation needs to be exterminated. Whatever the case, we won't be visiting the Palm House today." Holmes was about to turn to leave when one of the guards approached us. "Mr. Holmes," he called. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the famous detective?" Holmes stopped. "Quite right," he confirmed. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson." The man approached the barricade and introduced himself. My name is James Taylor. I lead the security team at Kew Gardens. A pleasure to meet you, I replied. What can we do for you? Mr. Taylor began to whisper. We are dealing with a most unpleasant and unsavory situation in the Palm House, but we don't want to cause a scene. I looked around. The crowd had grown. Everyone was trying to find out what had happened inside the glass house. It may be a trifle too late, I concluded soberly. Taylor sighed. Gentlemen, he explained in a soft voice, there was an incident. A dead body was discovered in the Palm House. Holmes's eyes lit up. Should this insufferable excursion to the London suburbs suddenly offer Holmes an opportunity to preoccupy himself with death and murder, he would be instantaneously contented. You don't say, he remarked casually, trying to contain his excitement. And do you believe the death to have occurred from unnatural causes? Don't get me wrong, Mr. Holmes, Taylor replied, but part of me very much hopes so. If not, the case would be even more puzzling than it already seems. Holmes and I exchanged glances. I am certain he could read from my expression that I would have preferred to continue our stroll towards the pond, but Holmes had firmly made up his mind. Very well, he said to Taylor, since we are here and don't have anything else to do, we could at least take a look. That would be most kind and helpful, Taylor answered, relieved. I had hoped that you would suggest it. He let us pass the barricade. Follow me. I will take you to the scene of the crime. The scene of the find, Holmes corrected. For now, all we know is where the body was found. Taylor nodded. That's correct, but it is a truly remarkable sight. You've surely never found a body like this before. He led us towards the entrance where his colleague opened the gate. Holmes followed eagerly, while I trailed reluctantly. The glass door closed behind us, and we instantaneously felt the temperature change. We left a typical early English autumn day and entered a hot and humid tropical climate. The conditions reminded me of the Indian jungle, which was precisely the point. Holmes remained stoic. Now, where is the body? He asked, a trifle impatiently. Taylor led the way. If you would please follow me, we need to walk over to the west wing. In a single file we traversed paths between lush vegetation, exotic trees, bushes and flowers. I must apologize for my poor knowledge of botany. I believe I noted palm trees and orchids among the many plants. We finally arrived at an intersection of paths. Taylor was certainly true to his word. We stood before a large and mysterious plant that in its pot towered 2.5 meters into the air. It featured some sort of extraordinary flower head in the shape of a pitcher with a diameter of approximately 1 meter that gave off a rather unpleasant foul odor. We could tell that it had an opening on top and was quite stable because 2 human legs were protruding out of it. An upside-down dead body was stuck inside of a giant pitcher-shaped blossom. For heaven's sake, I stammered quietly as Holmes remarked soberly, why, I've never seen anything like it. Luckily, Taylor explained, we spotted this before the Palm House opened and immediately informed Scotland Yard, but it could take up to an hour before the first investigators arrive. We are here now, Holmes said confidently, though I did not know where he was drawing his confidence from. Let's see what we can find out until they arrive. The first thing I'd like to know is, are you familiar with the deceased? Unfortunately, yes, Taylor answered. I recognized him immediately by his boots. He is our horticulturist in training, Mr. Palmer, a young lanky man with the body and mind of a child. He has only been training with us for 2 weeks. The poor lad. Mr. Palmer was in training, I interjected, meaning he would have been fairly inexperienced. Could this have been an accident? Holmes shook his head emphatically. Unlikely, he objected. That would require a series of highly improbable events. We know Mr. Palmer couldn't have reached the top of the plant without assistance, so he couldn't have arrived at it alone, unless he had a ladder, but there is none in sight. In my opinion, it is far more likely that his lifeless body was deposited inside of the pitfall trap. Presumably, the perpetrator was in a rush, which is why he left Mr. Palmer's feet protruding out of it. I have no doubt that this here is a case of murder." "That is difficult to believe," Taylor stuttered, his face pale. "Mr. Palmer was liked by all employees. He was such a kind, cheerful lad, always ready to help, always a smile on his lips." Before Taylor could continue with his praise, I steered the conversation back to the questions relevant to the investigation. "Who found the body?" "Mr. Blackwater, first thing this morning on his daily inspection," answered Taylor. "He is the fellow standing guard outside the front entrance. You've already encountered him." Holmes nodded. "Ah, yes, I remember. We'll have to speak to him later." "Of course," Taylor remarked. "I'm sure Mr. Blackwater will be happy to cooperate. He came across this situation at around 8:30. I was informed and rushed over straight away. We didn't touch anything and immediately closed the Palm House to the public and called the police." Holmes paced back and forth at the intersection. "So you did everything right," he said, and stopped walking. "Who else was in the Palm House at the time?" Taylor thought about it for a long time. "2 others," he answered. "The Palm House's head gardener, Mr. Greenfell, who happens to be, or have been, Mr. Palmer's mentor, and Mr. Redwood, our tropical botanist and scientific director." I refrained from making a quip about the employees' flowery names, as Holmes was pacing again, muttering incomprehensible words to himself. Taylor threw me a questioning glance, and I nodded back at him, assuring him this was Holmes's normal behavior. "Well then," Holmes announced, as he stopped directly before us, "let's begin by questioning Mr. Redwood. Mr. Taylor, would you please find your head botanist and bring him here?" "Certainly. I'll be on my way at once," the chief security guard replied, and left Holmes and me to ourselves. Now that we were alone, I pulled out my handkerchief and wiped the sweat off my brow. The artificial tropical heat was getting to me, but Holmes seemed unbothered by it. "Well now, my dear friend," I began, and leaned against a planting table. "I must admit the situation we encountered here is somewhat sensational, yet, or rather therefore, I would not know where to begin a reasonable investigation. The whole thing is quite a mystery. If it weren't such a tragic incident, one would have to call it a case of utter nonsense. Perhaps we better leave it to the police." "Slow down, my dear Watson," Holmes objected. "We shan't allow ourselves to become distracted by this peculiar crime scene, which may have to do with the perpetrators being in a rush. As always, we shall proceed in a systematic manner. Observation, analysis, interrogation, and deduction. We don't yet know the cause of death. I am sure that Mr. Palmer did not fall into the pitcher plant accidentally, regardless of whether he was by himself or in the company of someone else. It is therefore imperative that we recover the body to examine it. We will also want to hear what the other employees have to say." As so often, Holmes was right. For better or worse, I could bid adieu to my casual excursion into nature as prescribed by Dr. Kurzman. In Holmes's company, one was never spared death, decay, and crime, even in one's pastime. And so I resigned to my fate. "Very well," I said after some reflection. "We are dealing with a potential murder in a dense jungle inside of a large confined building with glass walls. Only 5 people, including Mr. Taylor, have access to the Palm House. One of them is dead. The perpetrator must therefore be one of the remaining 4. Holmes nodded. "That was a fine deduction and summarization," he concluded, "and that means there are more suspects than we'd like." Thereupon, Taylor returned. He was accompanied by a slightly older professional type, the botanist, Mr. Redwood, as we learned from our introduction. Redwood seemed frustrated to have been interrupted from his work. He kept stroking his white beard and cleaning his round glasses demonstratively. "Well now, Mr. Holmes," he explained, "as you can imagine from my position, I am a very busy man and carry a great deal of responsibility for Her Majesty's exotic cultivations. Ask your questions, but make it quick." I was aggravated by Redwood's poor manners. Holmes, though, did not seem bothered. "We certainly don't want to take more of your time than necessary," he replied calmly, "Let's get straight to the point. Where were you this morning when the body was discovered? In the pitcher plant." Redwood became even more indignant and began to raise his voice. "Are you suspecting me of having committed this crime? That is outrageous!" "By no means, Mr. Redwood," Holmes assured. "By inquiring the whereabouts of all employees, we are merely collecting witness statements that could be useful in solving the case. You are, of course, entirely free to leave at any point, or you can assist us as a potential witness. As a scholar, you must be exceptionally perceptive and highly intelligent. Isn't that so?" Redwood hesitated briefly. Then his vanity took charge. "All right, Mr. Holmes." His tone was now friendly. "Of course, I won't hesitate in assisting you to the best of my abilities. As every morning, I was in the East Wing at 8:30, where I like to inspect the work of our gardeners before the gates open." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Holmes asked. Redwood shook his head. "Just the usual, Mr. Holmes. You probably know how support staff and subordinates can be. Our gardeners are simple folk, capable of digging a hole. But when it comes to carefully tending to exotic plants, they soon reach the limits of their minds and capabilities." Holmes did not just ignore Redwood's unnecessary denigration. He even nodded in agreement. "Good employees are hard to come by," he affirmed. "Does your criticism also apply to the victim, Mr. Palmer?" Redwood snorted like a horse. "Especially Palmer," he exclaimed. "He was a naive young lad, no idea about anything, dull and unwilling to learn. But that's not surprising given the man he was training under." "Are you referring to Mr. Greenfell?" I interjected. "Indeed," said Redwood. He had grown calmer now. "I had to put in a complaint with management about his incompetence on more than one occasion." Holmes kept a straight face upon hearing Redwood's accusation, even though a conflict between the two could be a potential clue. "I understand," he muttered. "So, if I understand you correctly, you didn't notice anything pertaining to the crime because you were busy at the other end of the Palm House?" "Correct," Redwood confirmed. "If you ask me, I wouldn't be surprised if our support staff got into a fight, probably over something trivial like football. It's also likely that alcohol was involved." Holmes did not engage with Mr. Redwood's accusation and steered the conversation in an entirely different direction. "Mr. Redwood," he began after a short pause, "as a leading specialist in tropical botany, you can surely provide me with some expert knowledge on this unusual crime scene. What kind of plant is this?" "Certainly," replied Redwood, who now, in his element, took a few steps towards the plant. "It is a Nepenthes penthesilea, a remarkable specimen, first discovered in the Amazon a few years ago. It is a species of pitcher plant, and an extraordinarily large example of one too. Naturally, a carnivore." "So it's a meat-eating plant?" I asked, making sure I understood correctly. "Yes, indeed, Dr. Watson," Redwood confirmed. "What looks like a blossom is really a cup or pitcher that emits an odor to attract insects, amphibians, and even small mammals. But it's a trap. Once an animal has entered, the smooth interior walls of the pitcher make it impossible for the animal to escape, while a digestive fluid at the bottom begins to break down its flesh while it's still alive." "I do very much hope," Taylor chimed in, "that poor Mr. Palmer isn't being consumed by the plant as we speak, or is he?" Redwood grimaced at the question and continued to focus on Holmes and me. "Mr. Taylor's naive concern is unfounded," he explained. "It takes an ordinary Venus flytrap one whole week to digest a common housefly. Even if this plant is many times larger, it would, theoretically, take several months or even a year to break down a human body, at which point the natural decaying process would have already done the job anyhow. In fact, the Nepenthes penthesilea does not feed on anything larger than frogs or sometimes mice." "How reassuring," remarked Taylor, and backed away from the plant as a precaution. Holmes, whose insidious sense for the macabre briefly shone through, was noticeably amused before composing himself again. "Thank you, Mr. Redwood," he said. "Your lavish descriptions will certainly be of use to us. We don't want to keep you any longer." Redwood bid farewell with a silent nod and hurried off. Holmes turned to Taylor. Now please get Mr. Greenfell." "Very well," said the security guard as he was leaving. Holmes glanced at the body sticking out of the meat-eating plant and called, "One more thing. Please ask Mr. Greenfell to bring a ladder." Taylor understood and nodded. Naturally, once we were alone again, I attempted to review what we had learned so far. Redwood, provided he is telling the truth, had nothing pertinent to offer in solving the case since, according to his testimony, he was too far away from the scene of the crime. That being the case, I found curious his scholarly overconfidence and disdain for the gardeners, whom he believed capable of misconduct and even murder. "That's all true, my good Watson," Holmes opined of my summary. "Apparently it's not entirely impossible to find a halfway decent employee." "Very kind, Holmes," I remarked without further engaging with his little quip. "To be honest, we haven't got much to work with." Holmes made a calming motion with his hand. "Do not worry," he reassured, "one step after the next. There is ample time before Scotland Yard arrives." I looked at Holmes suspiciously. "Is that what motivates you?" I asked. "To be quicker than the police?" Holmes smiled. "By no means," he objected firmly. "Not quicker, better." I was still thinking about Holmes's statement when Taylor returned. He was closely followed by Mr. Greenfell, whose clothes clearly identified him as a gardener. He was carrying the ladder we requested. As the two were approaching, Greenfell glanced at the victim's feet and quickly turned his head. It appeared to be a difficult sight for him. Taylor and Greenfell walked up to us. "Gentlemen," Taylor said, "may I introduce Mr. Greenfell, our head gardener, and Mr. Palmer's supervisor." Holmes and I both nodded silently at the gardener. He reached out his hand, which was dirty from working in the soil, and I leaned in to shake it before Holmes even had a chance to refuse the gesture. "I am Dr. Watson," I explained, "and this is Sherlock Holmes, detective from London." Greenfell did not seem very impressed. "A real detective?" he asked in Holmes's direction. "Then you've certainly taken down a number of miscreants in the past." "Indeed," Holmes confirmed. "Then do me a favor, detective," Greenfell continued abruptly. "Find my friend's murderer." Holmes only briefly hesitated, then assured, "We will certainly do so." I felt less optimistic but nodded enthusiastically so that we could get to the questions. "Mr. Greenfell," I began, "we don't want to beat around the bush. Where were you this morning at around 8:30, the presumptive time of the crime?" "In the tool shed next door," Greenfell answered without a moment of hesitation. "I was packing my work equipment, and it was taking longer than usual because I couldn't find my hedge shears." "I see," remarked Holmes. "And your colleague, Mr. Palmer, where was he?" Greenfell answered quickly again. "He had gone ahead to the palm house to see to the orchids. He was particularly fond of the orchids. He visited them every morning and evening. They're down the next path." I took over the interrogation again. "How was your relationship with Mr. Palmer? You mentioned you were friends." Greenfell looked down. "We didn't know each other long," he recalled, "but we got along from the very start. I looked after the lad. He needed help from time to time." "Do you mean at work?" I inquired. "Yes, indeed," Greenfell answered. "But he also let himself be bullied by others, especially superiors like Mr. Redwood, or by colleagues from security and management. I told him not to put up with everything and to demand the respect he deserves." Holmes, who had seemed a trifle absent, suddenly became restless. "The orchids?" he called. "Could you show me to the orchids?" Greenfell seemed surprised by Holmes's sudden request. "Naturally," he said, nodding his head. "If you would please follow me. They're just around the bend." Greenfell led the way. Holmes, Taylor, and I followed. We arrived at a sea of flowers at the top of the eastbound path, which meets the intersection by the meat-eating plant. "Here we are," Greenfell announced. "This is our main orchid collection. It encompasses nearly 200 species, primarily from the tropical regions of Asia and South America. Some of them are very rare, and thus extremely valuable." Holmes stared at the flowers seemingly absent-mindedly, mumbling irregular gaps. Nearly 1 minute passed before he turned back to us and said, "Well then, let's head back to recover the body." It was, to put it mildly, unclear to me what his mumbling had meant, but now our focus was rightly directed at the victim, who was still stuck inside the pitcher trap Greenfell set up the double ladder next to the plant, and we climbed up either end. Together we carefully pulled out Palmer's lifeless body. Greenfell then took Palmer into his arms like a child. The lanky lad weighed just over 100 pounds, and climbed back down the ladder, holding him. Greenfell gently laid the body on a tarp that we had prepared on the floor. That is when we immediately saw the cause of death. Head shears were sticking out of his chest. Greenfell's head shears, the ones he was looking for in vain this morning. "I promise I have nothing to do with this," Greenfell stammered when he spotted his gardening tool. "All right," Holmes remarked. "Any one of the employees could have taken them." "Just like the ladder," Taylor interjected. Holmes, who was leaning over the body, jumped up. "What do you mean?" "Well, Mr. Holmes," Taylor began, "when Mr. Greenfell and I went to fetch the ladder, it was not at its usual spot. Even though it was there last night, we found it near the main entrance. Perhaps this carries some significance." Holmes nodded. "It does," he said quietly. "It was used to discard the body and then abandoned in haste." He then turned to me. "Now, Doctor, what can you tell us about the victim?" I knelt down next to the body and examined the wound. "Hardly any blood was spilled due to the sharpness of the murder weapon," I explained. "Palmer was stabbed directly through his heart, causing a quick death. I will now pull out the shears." I pulled the murder weapon out of the victim's chest slowly and carefully. Because they were so long, the shears nearly penetrated Palmer's body front to back. When I wanted to share this discovery with the others, Holmes piped up. "What is this?" he asked. "There is something caught on the shears. Is that a piece of Palmer's clothing?" A small shred of a fabric-like material was pierced by the shears and remained stuck around the two blades like meat on a kebab. But apart from the puncture hole itself, Palmer's shirt appeared undamaged. I pulled off the shred and held it to the light. "This is a fragment of torn fabric or paper," I determined. "It's difficult to say what exactly it is, as it's soaked in blood." I handed the shred to Holmes, who pulled out his magnifying glass and came to a surprising conclusion within just a few seconds. "This is a fragment of cash," he announced. "Looks like a £10 note." "That's peculiar," remarked Greenfell. "Palmer was poor. He never had that much money on him." Holmes looked at the banknote fragment and began to pace. He finally came to a stop and said, "This is what happened. Palmer was holding the £10 note in his hand when the perpetrator went in to stab him unexpectedly. Palmer raised his hand in defense, and the banknote got between the tip of the shears and his chest. A small fragment of the note tore off as it was pierced by the shears. The perpetrator picked up the larger remaining piece of the £10 note and removed it from the scene of the crime." "But where did Palmer get so much money from?" asked Greenfell. Holmes did not have to think long. "From the perpetrator," he determined. "It must have been some sort of handoff. The perpetrator paid Palmer in exchange for something, then changed his mind and killed him. He took the money back from Palmer after he was dead, and that was his mistake." I was thinking about possible suspects when Taylor said, "What do you mean? What mistake?" Holmes smiled contentedly. "I will solve the case shortly," he declared. "Mr. Taylor, would you be so kind as to gather the employees by the main entrance? Mr. Greenfell, Mr. Redwood, and Mr. Blackwater, even though we haven't yet had the opportunity to question him. We will wait there for Scotland Yard to arrive." Taylor shrugged. "Whatever you say, Mr. Holmes. We'll meet at the entrance in 5 minutes." Taylor and Greenfell walked off, leaving us to ourselves. Before Holmes and I made our way to meet the others at the entrance, we covered Palmer's body and collected the evidence, the head shears, and the torn fragment of a £10 note. "I know what you're planning," I said as we walked down the main path towards the entrance. "You want to complete a puzzle." "Congratulations, my dear Watson," Holmes answered. "You're learning." Holmes's remark stopped me in my tracks, as it treaded a thin line between actual appreciation and mockery. That is when I noticed that I was standing beside the orchids again. "Holmes!" I cried. "What about the orchids? What did you observe here?" Holmes turned around and walked back to me. "Don't you see?" he asked, pointing at the patch of orchids. Nothing stood out to me, I had to admit. "No? What is it?" The motive, Holmes explained. Watson, you're looking, but you're not seeing. The flowers were planted in uniform rows. But look at these gaps. They don't seem intentional. They look to be new. Now I saw them too. You're right, I cried. Several plants had been dug up and removed throughout the patch. Of course I'm right, Holmes asserted. And we can presume that these weren't exactly the cheapest orchids. No, they were presumably the most expensive, with a significant black market value, I added. Nonetheless, what does this have to do with the perpetrator and victim? Holmes tapped his temple. I have a theory, he said, and we shall now try to prove it. When we arrived at the main entrance of the Palm House, all 4 employees were already waiting for us. Taylor, Blackwater, Redwood, and Greenfell. Gentlemen, Holmes began, thank you for coming. One of you, however, will soon regret having accepted my invitation. For one of you murdered young Mr. Palmer, and to make matters worse, deposited his body inside a meat-eating plant. But let's take one step at a time. The Royal Palm House accommodates a stunning and very valuable orchid collection. I couldn't help but notice, however, that the collection has recently been a trifle diminished. One of the employees has been stealing particularly valuable specimens and selling them for personal gain. This enterprise could have certainly continued if Mr. Palmer hadn't been especially keen on the orchid patch. He noticed the missing flowers and identified the thief. But instead of reporting him to the park administration or police, Palmer tried to get a piece of the pie. He began blackmailing the orchid thief, demanded cash in exchange for silence. The thief, however, did not want to pay at all or any longer, which is why he stabbed Mr. Palmer with head shears when they met for the handover this morning, shortly before the doors opened to the public. That is why the perpetrator needed to make Palmer's body disappear quickly, and that is how it ended up trapped in the pitcher of an Amazonian carnivorous plant, and the murderer walked away. You have all stated that you were somewhere else around the time of the crime, just before 8:30. Mr. Taylor was in the administration building. Mr. Blackwater was on his daily tour. Mr. Redwood was checking the east wing, and Mr. Greenfell was gathering his tools. None of you encountered one another. None of you can prove where you said you were. That means none of you have alibis, and each one of you could be the murderer. The murderer, however, made a careless mistake. He left behind a small fragment of a £10 note that tore off during the deadly assault and was pierced by the shears. When we find the banknote that matches the fragment, we will have found our perpetrator. Gentlemen, you know what comes next. I must ask you to get out your wallets to see whether the banknote in question is in your possession. You naturally have the right to deny our request, since Dr. Watson and I are merely advising detectives. If so, however, Scotland Yard will perform a search as soon as their officers arrive, which should be any moment now. That will be all. Thank you for your patience. There was silence. Holmes lit the pipe he had been packing throughout his lecture. No one moved. The 4 employees just passed one another suspicious and tense glances. If the perpetrator wanted to make an escape, he would have had to do it now. But something else happened. Redwood suddenly grabbed Blackwater by the collar and cried, "You wretched idiot! You've ruined everything!" Blackwater broke loose and pushed back Redwood. "Shut your trap! They don't have anything on us!" Even Holmes seemed surprised and found no words. "The 2 of you conspired!" Taylor exclaimed. "It was all his idea!" Blackwater cried, pointing at Redwood. "I know nothing about orchids." "But you murdered Palmer," Redwood countered. "I had nothing to do with the murder." "What should I have done?" asked Blackwater. "He wanted more and more money, or he was going to turn us in." Redwood shook his head resignedly. "If you hadn't taken the money, they couldn't have proven anything." Blackwater raised his arms in despair. "But I don't even have the goddamned £10. In that moment, 2 officers from Scotland Yard knocked on the glass door. Holmes slowly walked to the entrance and opened it. "Gentlemen," he said to Redwood and Blackwater, "you may continue your confessions at the police station." On the ride home to Baker Street, I could not withhold from asking Holmes about his nearly failed attempt at solving the case. "I don't like to say it, Holmes," I began, "but your plan could have failed miserably. In fact, it was destined to fail. Were it not for Redwood losing his nerve, they would have both gotten away with it." "My dear Watson," Holmes answered calmly, "I build my cases on the principles of science and deduction. I base my solutions on human logic, for I have found this to be the most successful method. Yet it always carries with it a certain risk of failure. To be honest," I continued, "this time only pure luck saved us from failure." Holmes shook his head emphatically. "It wasn't a matter of luck nor coincidence. In the end, we cornered the perpetrators, which provoked a reaction from Redwood, thanks to his fragile disposition. Apparently, Holmes was far from ready to admit that he had lost control today, and that in the end he only succeeded by a stroke of luck. Just as I was ready to resign myself to Holmes's account of the day's events, he brought up another question. "One thing would interest me," he said pensively. "Where is the missing banknote?" Naturally, I did not know the answer, and so we continued our ride in silence. The banknote, in fact, was not found on Blackwater, because of the perpetrators' mutual accusations and confessions, which they repeated in the custody of the police. The whereabouts of the £10 note no longer carried any significance. Mr. Greenfell, however, discovered the money the next day inside of the carnivorous Nepenthes penthesilea and was able to remove it before the plant's digestive secretions could break it down.